All right. Well, thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much for everybody here today. Muchas gracias a todas las personas presentes hoy día de Chile también. Yeah, this is such an important moment, and I'm very happy to I don't know, the whole process of entering into UMass and the program, the whole experience has been so good. And yeah, well, today I'm going to present the main ideas of my dissertation defense. Let me start sharing my screen. Can you see my screen? Yes? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So let's start. The title of my dissertation is An Experiential Approach to Test Design and Validation. In Spanish, for people here, una aproximación experiencial al diseño y validación de pruebas. And the main topic of the dissertation, the one topic that's going to appear over and over is this idea of what's the experience of a person that is taking a test? What's the experience of a person that is being assessed? Trying to, how is that we can acknowledge, understand, improve this aspect of testing, like the point of view of the test taker and how they are living in the within the experience of confronting a test, of being assessed, of being evaluated. The origins of the idea of the experiential approach comes from game design. Game design has been for me like a long-term hobby. I've always been interested into that. And it was very interesting when I started to learn more about test design in the program. I could compare because I was kind of reading also things in game design. I started to learn more about test design, and it was very, I don't know, like easy to compare and see the differences. And one big difference is that game design is always thinking about what is perceived, like the subjective perception of whatever you are presenting. So it's not that much about being objective about whatever you are doing in the test. It's more about how it is perceived, how it is experienced on the side of the player. Because when you are designing a game, you still, the main thing that you want to have is to have a fun game, you know, like to create a device that can elicit something fun and enjoyable. And in testing, we don't do that. We do something very different. We are more worried about the validity of interpretation and uses, to have like scientifically proven inferences. And it's not that much worried about how it is subjectively perceived a test and how that actually can be important. So I mentioned this idea to Steve, this difference. Steve was, I think he identified the value of this idea far more than I could understand at the moment. He encouraged me to kind of like continue with this. So the design principles are kind of clear in terms of like what people do in game design, how you can kind of use that in test design, but still you need to have valid interpretation and uses. So you have this interesting trade-off in which you want to create better experiences, you want to make a test more, I don't know, more reasonable, more delightful, as people in Duolingo say, but still you will need to have valid interpretation and usage. You are going to use whatever you are building. So how do you do both at the same time? And that's why the title says experiential approach to test design and validation. In the sense that the dissertation is proposing something that helps both design and validation, and the proposal on each is kind of coherent and is synergic. So you can use both at the same time. So in a nutshell, like what is the experiential approach? I think it can be condensed in these 4 definitions. So big part of the work in the dissertation is like a theoretical work, if you want, in which I start to read a lot of literature and try to rethink how is that we can define these very important concepts in our field from this experiential, phenomenological, like thinking about like how people perceive the consciousness of being assessed, etc. So in the experiential approach, I am defining a test as a device with a purpose that elicits experiences that allow an observer to make inferences about an individual. Here in this definition, I am making more explicit the idea that a test is a device that elicits experiences. So that's kind of like the experiential take on the definition. Also, I understand an assessment technology as an ecosystem of devices that allow a test to be used according to its purposes. Something that we will see through the dissertation is that a test is never alone. You always have many other devices that help and allow a test to be used. And for example, in the case of specifically of a test, you will have test preparation materials, or you will have, I don't know, a rule to do some decision, or you will have score reporting, or you will have, I don't know, like many devices that actually on themselves, they can be designed, but are helpful and part of an ecosystem that allows a test to be used. So that's what I would call an assessment technology. Validity, I understand validity as the set of situated knowledges constructed by a researcher and the communities affected by the use of the test about the appropriateness, adequacy, and preferability of future instantiations of the test, interpretations to be done with those instantiations, and the procedures in which those instantiations will be useful. This definition sounds a lot like MESIC, but it's changing important things here and including a more critical perspective on the definition in the concept of situated knowledges, including also this word preferability, including the role of the communities affected by the uses of the test, and include like some updates in that definition. And finally, test validation, I understand that as the process by which a researcher builds an experience that will explain the validity of a test to the communities affected by the use of the test. Here, validation, I kind of build up on Keynes' argument-based approach, but the idea of argument is kind of generalized to an experience that will explain. So that's kind of like the experiential take in the end on that level too, that we worry about like presenting the evidence in some argument, but it might not be an argument the only way. You can do other ways of doing it. But always you should be thinking about the experience that whatever you are using to communicate is eliciting in the audience. So the dissertation in the end is going, I mean, it's not exactly a series of papers, but you can see that there are like a series of papers that are underneath and are chapters or sections in the dissertation. There are at least 3 papers that are more theoretical and are the literature reviews, conceptual frameworks, like theoretical work. And 2 papers that are empirical studies, are proof of concepts, are more, I don't know, like baby steps into the application on all of these ideas. So the first paper of this is a conceptual framework to understand what is assessment experience. Another paper is one literature review about feminist epistemologies, entering more into this concept of situated knowledges that was mentioned before. Then there is one specific chapter in the dissertation that explains more explicitly what is the experiential approach for validation. And then the 2 proof of concept, one for the design part in which we build something. We designed like a test, a diagnostic test with Professor Lisa Keller for her regression class. And one proof of concept for the validation part, in which we kind of try to do at least a simplified version of the experiential approach, using some information coming from Twitter and related with a test used in Chile for college admission. So those 5 papers in the end are kind of like the main flesh of the dissertation, if you will. And I will start explaining each of these and I don't know, like the different sections of the dissertation. Across all of the work done, there are 2 conceptual hypotheses that are going to be studied throughout the work done. First, we want to see if there is value in the experiential approach. If the experiential approach provides valuable information above and beyond other traditional methods. Like, is there any marginal value on the experiential approach? And second, is it feasible? Is it practical? Can we actually execute this? So that in the obstacles that I found during the whole process, also I will gain some information about, okay, if you want to implement these ideas, what are the challenges? What are the problems, limitations that you can find? So about the theoretical foundations of the experiential approach, this conceptual framework for assessment experience. as when I started to think about, okay, we want to do this experiential game design, gameful design, some people use that expression. You say a lot, experience elicited, or I don't know, you use a lot the concept, but what is experience? That was like a very important question at the beginning that I wanted to respond, and I wasn't like comfortable to go further without having like a proper definition for it. I started to do some reviews of, I don't know, like reading papers and trying to understand like what other people in other fields have done in theoretical, I don't know, like other conceptual frameworks in other fields. The dictionary definition for experience is something that has like at least two flavors. You can understand experience as the more immediate or instantaneous stream of information that a person can perceive, but also experience can refer to like a narrative, like something that you kind of process from that raw stream of information, and you kind of like curate that and kind of like say, okay, like a story about or something that happened. In my readings, I found many conceptual frameworks that were referring to Dewey. Dewey, he wrote a book called Experience and Education that is very famous, very important in the educational field. And Dewey, in his ideas about education, he actually started to speak a lot about experience. And he presents these principles about experience that I found very important. And I based the conceptual framework to understand assessment experience from this theoretical view. So the idea, Dewey explains that in general experience first happens through interactions. We experience as we interact with environment or with an object, but there is some experience is defined by that interaction of ourselves with something. Also, he mentioned that in general experience is lived as a continuum between past experiences and expectations on future experiences. So it's not that you leave something in isolation, you are always kind of like coming back to the past, but also affected by expectations on about the future. And finally, there is this idea that experience, we make sense of it. We process basically experience. And as we process experience, we re-interact and we re-experience things after we have actually lived them. So these three principles configure the main dimensions in the conceptual framework that I propose specifically for the concept of assessment experience. This is like a diagram of how I see this idea of assessment experience. So basically a person when takes a test, it will interact with the test. So I will define certain types of interaction. And also it's going to have this continuity principle that affected by past experiences, with also affected by expectations on future experiences as the person experiences a test. And finally, the whole assessment experience, we are making sense of that. So we make sense that on isolation, but also we can make sense that with peers, and we can make sense of that with this designer actually. And all of this is happening every time somebody takes a test or is being assessed. The principle of interaction, I define 5 categories: cognitive, emotional, expressive, fluent, and physical. That's kind of like at least five types of interaction that you can identify. Cognitive, as the word says, in reaction to the test, you may start to think or have like some cognitive reaction to whatever you're saying. Emotional, referring to emotions that can happen in reaction to something that you see in the test. Expressive, when you feel this need to say something or to have an opinion or to express yourself. Fluent is when you have a reaction that is more subconscious or more automatic. And physical, where it's something that is more anchored in the body. Like, for example, when your eyes move, for example, or I don't know, like depending on the test, actually the physical interaction is the main interaction. For example, in sports, in the test, we'll expect a physical interaction, not necessarily a cognitive one. Fluent as a category is a bit different in the sense that it's more about the way in which interaction happens. So fluent as a category is special in the sense that every interaction in the fluent category actually corresponds to one of the other 4, but is done in a way that is automatic and subconscious, if you want. So for example, eye tracking, when you see a person that is, doesn't notice, but they are looking at the image in an item. That's like a physical interaction, But if it is done subconsciously, it becomes like a fluent interaction. Principle of continuity. I just define categories in terms of like stages in the assessment experience. 0 refers to the moment itself in which you are assessed, but the other refer to like previously or after you did the test. And sense making, I define 5 levels of how much you are making sense of your experience. Free stream, you don't do that much processing. That's what typically you study in a think aloud protocol. Immediate, when you are actually having a little bit of processing in the experience, but not completely. Integrative, when you actually finish the test and you kind of like speak about it as a story. Co-integrative, when you do this narrative, also including others like peers or some other people into that making sense. And dialogical, when you include the test designer into that process of sense making. Another piece of theoretical work, if you want, in the dissertation is this idea of feminist epistemology, situated knowledges. So, okay, that conceptual framework that kind of like puts you in some theoretical, I don't know, like space in which you can locate experience, you can speak about it, you can speak more clearly what is experience. But then you have another important question. Okay, maybe it's nice to study experience, but why it is necessary? Like why we really need to study experience? And I found a very rich literature in feminist scholars and feminist epistemologies. And their work really like tackles a lot of the problems that we're having right now in testing, and actually gives this response about why it is necessary an experiential approach. Not that it's nice to have it, but why really we need to do this. This is an excerpt from one paper written by Donna Haraway that defines this idea of situated knowledges, and I think this piece kind of explains very well what is this idea of situated knowledges. I will read this. The moral is simple, only partial perspective promises objective vision. All Western cultural narratives about objectivity are allegories of the ideologies governing the relationships of what we call mind and body, distance and responsibility. Feminist objectivity is about limited location and situated knowledge, not about transcendence and splitting of subject and object. It allows us to become answerable for what we learn how to see. Donna Haraway, in her paper, he proposed a different way to do scientific research, in which you take in full account the fact that we are human beings, flesh and blood, in a world affected by a context. She uses the expression God trick to refer to the more classical scientific work in which the researcher kind of disappears and speaks about everything from nowhere. And it speaks with certain omnipotence about what you can do. Situated knowledge goes completely in the opposite direction. We are partial, and objectivity is understood more as candid partiality, in which we share how is that we can be partial. All of this is very important to understand how system of oppression actually can happen in our research. And when we do this kind of study of self-awareness, of reflexivity, to understand how is that we are partial, then we can identify how it can happen that those systems of oppression can appear through our work. Situated knowledge is a complicated concept, but this table from Donna Haraway's paper kind of like explain the contrast. So in the very end, situated knowledge is like more like an ethnographic take on scientific research, in which you are kind of avoiding to have master theories, but having more webbed accounts, or actually the one paper speaks about, assembled arguments. That's the concept that ADI, for example, uses for in the case of test validation. And it's going more on the local, on the situated, and avoiding to have these kind of like master theories about everything, but going more into the local. Also expecting to have double vision, like assuming that there's not going to be like a unique truth of something, and also recommending a lot to see participants as agents. So it's even further on the study of the experience. It's not just doing like interpreting experience, but it's letting them to be part of whatever we are doing, and themselves, they put their experiences into our work. So, I mean, I could speak a lot about this, but the main takeaway is that validity can be understood from this concept of situated knowledges. So one innovation, if you want, one thing that I'm proposing in the experiential approach is that in a theoretical level, validity should be understood as a set of situated knowledges instead of a evaluative judgment as Messick was thinking about validity. This is a picture of a participatory work. So in the end, the implications of understanding validity in this theoretical level as a situated knowledge implies in the end a more ethnographic, a more participatory, a more phenomenological take on test design and validation. And here, basically, the response to why do we need the experiential approach? Well, there are many ways, the many reasons for why. First, it can happen that a structure of oppression can appear through our work. So when we study experience, but not just a study, but when we let those experiences enter into our work, you can identify and fight back, if you want, those systems of oppression. Finally, the experiential approach, like this is like the last part of the theoretical section. Okay, as I was thinking about this idea of centering around experience, okay, we have kind of like a reasonable response to the question, what is experience? Why do we need it? Yeah, okay, we have some epistemologies that actually make sense for this. How we do this in practice? And how we do this in practice in a way that is coherent with a lot of user experience research that you will do anyways if you start to do this kind of game design-ish application in test design. And one interesting thing when you start to study user experience is that users will tell you actually very quickly about what is wrong. And they will reach you and they will say, I think this can improve, or maybe this is a risk, or I don't know, like start to speak about what could be wrong with the test. And given that, I mean, if we come back to the conceptual framework about assessment experience, that is very complete, very rich, in which we have like stages, level of sense-making, interactions. So if we study all of it, really, really like are intense and extensive on that study, is it possible that we can detect any source of invalidity in the study of user experiences? That's a question that is tricky to respond. On one side, I don't think there is like a proper rationale to respond to it. On the other side, you can kind of like reverse the argument and say, well, if there is an invalidity that doesn't have like a reflection in user experience, is something that we really, it's that important. Maybe it is there, but why it is important? I don't know. This question is more philosophical, I think, and definitely will require more years of research, I think, to be truly responded. But if we assume for 1 second that that is actually true, then we can define a proper approach to validation that can leverage on this. And basically the initial idea of the experiential approach is to sketch an argument, but using a reductio ad absurdum, argument strategy, or what in math is called a profile contradiction. So basically, if you want to argue that your interpretation, your use is valid, then you assume for 1 second that it's not valid. And then from user experience, you come up with a list of what are the potential problems. And then you do research to kind of like refute or fail to refute those validity hypotheses. Here, it is important to mention that experience is not evidence by itself. It's more used to generate hypotheses. Sometimes, eventually, you can consider that as face value, but initially on the experiential approach, that role is more about creating questions and what should we study, not necessarily to assume face value that whatever test takers say is true and period. These are the definitions I mentioned at the beginning. And in the definition of validity, you will see these 4 questions that are going to be the ones guiding the validation work I will do in the proof of concept in the next sections. I call these 4 questions the PAAP minimum for test validation. So partiality, appropriateness, adequacy, and preferability. Partiality refers to this idea of situated knowledges and the gut trick, and this idea that we are partial, situated, trying to respond that type of questions of context and where we are, etc. Actually, this is very, very related with Jennifer's work when she proposed this set of questions for the anti-racist assessment or in her validity proposal. All these kind of questions that you're criticizing most of them can be part of this acknowledgement that we are partial and situated. Appropriateness refers to the moral philosophy question. Is it good or bad to use the test? This is the question that Messi brought into his framework. Here we are taking a different response though. We are not worried that much about consequences. We are more worried about what are the values of the communities. So it's more about depending on what the community approaches the problem of moral philosophy of, is it good or bad to use this test? Adequacy refers to the test is whatever we are doing with the test, is it fulfilling its purpose? So it's more about scientific correctness, constructibility, like that type of question. And preferability is everything else that we put as an expectation on the test. So here in preferability question is when we can put this kind of I don't know, like requirements that you may have to have a test that is more engaging, or a positive assessment experience, or a delightful assessment experience. Actually, in terms of expectation, there are already a lot of expectations that sometimes we put in tests. For example, some impact in a learning experience, or some social positive impact that you may want to have with a policy, with a test. Those are expectations that go in this question, the preferability question. And the experiential approach, in the end, proposes like a procedure to, like, okay, this is one way to go. If we follow like very strictly the situated knowledges concept, this should be negotiated and changed on every context. But at least I wanted to give at least one idea of how to operationalize this. So the idea would be that first you study user experiences across different type of users. Then you come up with a list of invalidity hypotheses. Then you prioritize those hypotheses with the input of the users. And then you do research to refute or fail to refute the invalidity hypotheses that are more important to study. Then you make the communities vote about the whole result of the thing. And in the end, you have a sketch of an interpretation and use argument with the evidence that you obtain in the process. If you refute it, then you have warrants. If you fail to refute it, you have rebuttals. And here is when you connect with the Keynes argument-based approach, in which, in the end, the summary is the argument as in that approach, but you don't start from it. You kind of like do it in the end.
Sergio, I think it's just a good time to do a time check. So you're about half an hour in, so we have about 15 minutes left. Okay.
Yes. So now I will speak more about the empirical studies and the proof of concepts. So, okay. Theoretical work, a lot of ideas, a lot of things that we could do. What happened when we put this in practice? And first, I will speak about the proof of concept on the design part. I wanted to build something using this approach. And well, I mean, I made a call with the professors at UMass, Professor Keller, Professor Wells. They both responded to the call. Unfortunately, with Professor Wells, we couldn't finish the project, but with Professor Keller, we could do the diagnostic test. And in the end, what we agreed with Professor Keller was to do a diagnostic test for her class, a regression class at UMass. And we started to do like an iterative process. And we started kind of follow this idea of game design, which you kind of like play test and prototype and kind of like enter into iterations on how to do this. And one important concept here is the idea of experience specification. So I won't be able to show all of it, but basically we use the conceptual framework for experience. And we start to think, okay, what do we want about this test? And try to put like similar to a specification table, but about the experience. So on each of these stages, on each of these type of interactions, on each of these levels of sense making, we said, okay, what do we want to elicit? And try to kind of like put in words, we want to do this with the test. And then have like more concrete actions. What actions we can take to elicit this type of interaction, this type of sense making. Here, I just put the specification on the continuity principle, like the temporal stage. And in the end, in the whole process, what we decided was to, in the pre-stage of the assessment experience, we put a survey. And we wanted to kind of like check with the students if what we wanted to do made sense for them in terms of item format. That was a way to include them in some participatory way, very weak, but at least have some participation. And then in the actual zero experience, to present a diagnostic test for the regression class. In terms of research questions, we put 3 specific research questions for this study. First, what are the students' preferences regarding their assessment experiences? Second, what's the initial state of the class regarding the content and the skills needed in that class? Like, do the diagnostic. And third, the assessment experience that in the end we created, how they evaluate that. Was good? Did we succeed on creating the type of experience that we wanted? So in terms of methods for the first research question, we included a specific question in the introductory survey asking about preferences for item format. And also we included 2 mock items, not asking like a question of the test, but using the different formats to see what was their reaction. So we asked for feedback about those mock items. So this is like a screenshot of the question that we ask about the item format. And we just asked very directly, like, what do you prefer? Multiple choice with 1 correct answer, multiple choice with more answer, and so on. This is a screenshot of one of the mock items. So at some point we thought, well, maybe if we just let them write whatever they know about certain concepts that are required in the class, that's going to be good enough to have a diagnostic idea of what's happening. And then we tested like another format in which we put a definition, and then we asked them to select concept within the definition that they do recognize. So with that, we can also have a sense of what they do not know by checking on what they don't click. Actually, this was like a feature that we agreed with Professor Keller, because at the beginning I was thinking to ask what do you don't recognize? And Professor Keller in the iterations, he said, maybe that's not a good idea. Let's ask more in positive. And so we made our inference from whatever they don't click, but not making them like acknowledge that they do not know something. In terms of results, people in general prefer multiple choice with 1 correct answer. It was like simpler, that class at least. This is kind of feedback that people provided about the mock items. In general, they preferred the second item format. They did not like much the first open-ended question. In general, there was this challenge actually to what does it mean to understand a concept? So people were saying, yeah, I can understand, but not necessarily can write a definition. So it's like 2 different things. In the end, we sensed that it was more comfortable for them to be asking the second format. So we proceed to do the diagnostic test using that item format. In terms of the actual diagnostic task, this is a screenshot of the type of questions that in the end we included in the diagnostic test, following this format that they prefer. And these are the results. So this is like the percentage of people not clicking on certain options. So for example, the concept of one-sided confidence intervals, yeah, maybe that was too weird. And not many people really knew what do you mean with that. But other concepts like statistic, population, distribution were kind of, I don't know, like better understood by the class. And finally, about the evaluation of the whole assessment experience that we created, We included 2 questions in the end of the diagnostic test, looking for feedback and also including like a 1 to 5 stars, saying like, okay, how do you evaluate the overall assessment experience? From the people that responded these tests, there was like 10 students. Most of them, they put 5 stars, and they were actually very positive on their feedback. 2 people were a little bit more critical, and 1 person felt confused that the format was kind of weird for that person, and they wasn't completely like happy with the test. They still put 3 stars. It wasn't like completely bad. And well, about the second proof of concept, now this is the validation part. All right, so the second part, the validation part. There is a test in Chile. I am from Chile, so I know a lot of the testing done in Chile, and there was this very interesting situation during the pandemic with a test used for college admission there. The college admission system in Chile depends a lot on the test. Actually, all the admission decisions are taken with just numbers, like either coming from high school GPA or the results in standardized test. So during the pandemic, there was this very interesting dilemma, because if you didn't do the test, then the whole admission process was kind of like affected, really affected. But if you do the test, then you were kind of risking people because there was a pandemic and it wasn't that easy. In the end, it was decided to actually do the test during the year of the pandemic. And that, of course, brought so many problems. But here it was important, or I don't know, it opened the opportunity to study experiences and how to actually see what exactly went wrong in all of this and what could be like a problem when you do interpretations of the data coming that year. So yeah, that was like a perfect opportunity to do the experiential approach. Also, I found that Twitter was like also a very good source of data to analyze, because it was free. I mean, it was really available. People were sharing their experiences in Twitter. So it was like, what was people saying in Twitter, and what we can say about the validity of the interpretation of uses of the test that year. So I gathered information from Twitter. I found around 10,000 tweets during the different stages in the assessment experience. There were some that were directed directly to the test designer, which is Denver. So these, I understand them as in the dialogical sense making, because they were trying to reach to the test designer. And the ones that were just using the name of the test that year was Prueba de Transición, those I understand more as co-integrative. So people were actually kind of like looking for some way of making sense of all of this as a group. The method for this, I took a sample of the tweets, 10%. I created a list of invalidity hypotheses coming from that analysis of the sample of tweets that I picked. I kind of used the experiential approach to validation using these PAAP questions and identifying devices that were kind of mentioned in the tweets. Then I did a survey asking students and members of the public, like, what's your priority in terms of what is more important to study? Then I found too many invalidity hypotheses. So in the end, I had to kind of like cluster them, and I created like overarching hypotheses that now we're reading in positive to kind of like say, okay, if you build an argument, what would be like the claim that you are actually supporting there? And then I did a sketch of a validity argument that in theory could respond to the concerns of the public. I couldn't do that much like research responding to the invalidity question, validity hypothesis, but at least I could do like a sketch of an argument coming from what people were saying. And in the end, I did a visualization of like a heat map of what parts of this argument actually are more important from the point of view of the public. The sample I received from the survey asking for priorities, 30 people, most of them were students. It was difficult to reach a student that actually did the test that year. But in general, I could have like enough people that were actually related with the test. This is the mean of the priority across different invalidity hypotheses. So you can see that in this section, there's like a lot of more priority here. Like there is a group of hypotheses that are clearly more important, and some other that are clearly less important. And you have like a big section that is more flat, and maybe it's not that clear that you can distinguish between them in terms of priority. There are a few that actually are like popping up, like really being more important. This is the list of the 7 more important invalidity hypotheses that were more priority by the public. And I don't know, test preparation materials appear. What happened with people that were having depression during the pandemic? Could they prepare? What happened with online classes? How that affected high school GPA? Different things that were important for people. This is the sketch of the final validity argument that emerged from this study. So in color, you will see like the different PIP, AAP questions, like each claim will correspond to something related with these questions that are part of the experiential approach. And these are the devices that are kind of like mentioned. So test preparation materials, you need to study them, the test itself, interpretation, actually the way in which you provide information also appear as something important. And here in color, you will see like what was more important for people from the public, what was more important to study. Test preparation materials, absolutely important that year, because really it was very difficult to prepare for that test in that context. So to understand how those materials were appearing, how people were preparing, seemed to be something important for the public. The history test also appeared something important that year. The history test had many problems, and the public kind of detected that. And also how it is used. Like the final use of this was also very important for the public. So in terms of discussion, like closing this presentation, we have 2 conceptual hypotheses, 2 proof of concepts. So in terms of the value of the experiential approach, in the first proof of concept, we could see that having this intention of like looking for some degree of participation, having feedback, trying to play test this, actually was quite successful into bringing an experience that many of the students felt like comfortable and good. On the validation part, the value of the experiential approach, I think, is coming from this idea that the sketch of the argument is emergent from the experiences and is not imposed by the expert. So we kind of showed how to do that. Actually, that's a criticism from Chappell about the argument-based approach, in that the experts usually build an argument around the research that they know they will want to do, or they know that it's working, but not necessarily what do you need really. In terms of practicality, like how feasible and practical is this? In the design part, we could do something related, low budget, but still it wasn't that participatory. So that the participatory part, I think, was the most complicated part to do. And on the validation part, I mean, we had access to actually a lot of information about the experience, but it was too much. And actually to process all of that was kind of tricky. And to reach specific people from the public also was complicated. To reach the students was a challenge. So in summary, I think the 2 proof of concept and these kind of baby steps in the approach shows you that there are kind of levels in which you can do more of this experiential approach. First, I think it started like more user experience research, trying to you as an expert interpret experience. Then when you really start to acknowledge this idea of situated knowledges, then you discover, okay, you should allow them to influence you and have participation, like break that wall between researcher and researcher. And then the final level that is more theoretical, and I couldn't do that, is to do user experience research specifically on the argument, to see how people read and perceive the argument or whatever you are building about the final results. This level is more complicated because you need evidence, you need research, and that for this dissertation was maybe too much, but that's kind of like the ideal level in the end. Summarizing innovations of the experiential approach, I am proposing a conceptual framework to understand assessment experience. I am redefining concepts like test, assessment technology, test validity, test validation from this experiential phenomenological perspective. I'm proposing these 4 questions to guide the validation. Partiality and preferability are 2 new questions there, or at least acknowledge them. The idea of experience specification, how to use this conceptual framework to actually do design and then specify what you want. And finally, I show a way to do like an emergent interpretation and use argument coming from user experience research. And to close the presentation, why the experiential approach matter? Why it is important? I think there are 3 main reasons. First, I think the whole idea and the practices I am proposing will help to close the distance between ourselves and the public. I think in general, the way in which I've been doing validation test design is so adversarial. It puts us in different teams, in different tribes, and it elicits like a conflict. So the experiential approach, I think, moves you in a different direction in which we can be more empathetic, but, validate the position of the public, put them, integrate them in our practice. Also, the experiential approach provides more tools into the toolkit of the resistance, like people that really want to push against the, I don't know, like bad things that have happened in our field. People are really trying to like move forward the field in a different direction, particularly by giving back agency to the communities. And finally, the experiential approach allows to consider this idea of experiential requirements, thinking about engagement, positive assessment, the delightful assessment experiences. All of that can be included in the experiential approach. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sergio. That was terrific. There was just so much there. I see some applauses on the top of the screen. So thank you so much for that. Especially the summary kind of summarizes, all of the different levels of contributions. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to the question period. We'll start with the members of the dissertation committee. Jennifer, why don't we start with you? Questions for Sergio?
Thank you. So thank you, Sergio, for that presentation. And I'm going to say every time you present it, I understand it a little bit more. So we only have to do this 2 more times, and then you're done. No, I'm just kidding. So I want to focus on something different than what I'm usually looking at. But in your discussion, which, by the way, I appreciate how you just kind of went through that discussion and did not mince words. The way you did that was very refreshing. Like, I tried this and that was a hot mess. And so we tried this and that was a semi-disaster. And these are all of the concerns. And I really appreciate how you laid out the concerns, particularly around, like, in order to do this, people have to be motivated to do it, right? The user has to be motivated to engage in it, which is perhaps where the gaming world and the education world kind of diverge, right? Because gamers will engage in order to make sure you can provide them with a meaningful, engaging game in the end, whereas trying to convince even apparently graduate students and undergraduate students to engage, they don't care. And I've been in focus groups where students have said literally tests are not supposed to be fun. And I just want it to be over. Like, they have said that. So you try to make it engaging for them and they appreciate your efforts. And they also say, please stop making the effort. We have come to believe that this is going to be a horrible experience and we would just like it to move more quickly. But beyond that, so thank you for laying that out. That was really lovely and beautiful. In the end, you kind of threw something out there that I thought was interesting. Highlighted it here. Another interesting path is on page 165. Is in the connections of the experiential approach and critical race theory. And you wrote here, the experiential approach is more passive on detecting structures of oppression, and that it waits for the experiences to report those, to then start doing some research about them, et cetera, et cetera. And I wanted actually really for you to say more about where you think these things intersect. And is it critical race theory where there is this connection, or could it really be any critical theory, right? Because I know your work is kind of rooted in feminist methodologies, and there's also Black feminist theory and queer theory and other critical theories that might also be appropriate. So really just wanted you to say more about that, because I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, when I presented some early idea of the experiential approach in the Gordon Centennial celebration, actually that was an observation from Edmund Gordon. And he told, like, this, whatever you presented, what's the relationship of this with critical race theory? And that was kind of like coming back to that presentation. I want to kind of like put that in the discussion as well. Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is that situated knowledges, the concept of situated knowledges, as I understood, and I'm not sure if this is like the way, but at least the way I kind of integrated it. Sure, we'll put you in this kind of critical, empathetic, phenomenological stance to do research. But I truly question if you really are piercing through system of oppression in that process, that procedure. So the implicit hypothesis there is that when you give agency to the communities, then you are going to do that, you are going to break the system of oppression in their terms. But it can happen that if the community is not prepared to do that, or if they don't want to do that, maybe it won't happen. And actually, that's a kind of question of the role of the communities versus the role of a vanguard, or like group of people that are actually more like aware of these programs and how you can like manage both. So that's why I was thinking that if there is a critical aspect of the experiential approach, it's more passive because it is expecting from the communities to kind of like bring their critical views. And if there's no critical view there, then it won't be that critical. The problem is that the experiential approach as it is defined right now is situated knowledge. So also it will depend on context. So to respond to your question, it's really complicated to do that because it will depend literally on the specific context in which you are. There are places in which it's not truly feasible to be that critical. I mean, if you're, let's say you are doing in Iran, test validation, and you truly like really go all the way, there are going to be limitations on how to do this. So that's why kind of like the experiential approach in that regard is more flexible, but not necessarily that, I don't know, like for sure that you are going to be critical. And also it depends on the practitioner. I think when you ask about the partiality question, you will think also about who is executing this. And it will depend also about their view, their positionality. So yeah, I mean, in summary, I think that the experiential approach is open to it and is critical friendly, if you want.
Thank you, Sergio and Jennifer. Jennifer, any follow-up, or should we move to
No, feel free to
Michael?
move.
Okay, thank you. Michael, why don't we turn to you next?
Thank you. So, Sergio, I have to say that, I first became familiar with your work during that Edmund Gordon session, and I was very happy to be part of your dissertation committee because then I got to learn all about it, right? So, and there's some really fascinating work here, and I'm looking forward to seeing this published. I'm looking forward to seeing the reaction of the public, and I want to see more research focused on these issues from you, but also from others who I think are going to be very interested. So now, you know, my background is in, I've worked for many years in the testing industry. So I got to give you a little bit of a setup for this question. So I'm going to describe the places in the test development process for a large scale assessment where the public is involved. And then I want to know if you can tell me what the experiential approach will add to that to make it even better. Okay. So a typical test development, they start with a test blueprint. They're going to have claims and evidence that are developed by subject matter experts, including teachers. And then they're going to develop, based on that blueprint, item prototypes. Again, subject matter experts are involved with that. They're going to have focus groups involving students and teachers who are going to evaluate these. Then they're going to have maybe a short test. They're going to give these to students. They'll have and think aloud protocols, maybe some cognitive labs to understand, are these students really getting this? Then they're going to develop a test prototype. They'll have field tests, and could be anywhere from 100 students to at least one testing program I worked on, 250,000 students taking these field tests, and then they'll have surveys, they'll have interviews, including questions on, was this easy, was it hard, did you feel comfortable, all these kinds of, did you get it, and then they'll have the actual test. and after the test, post-test interviews and surveys to get at whether the students are satisfied with that experience. Did they find the test too long? Did it cover the material fairly? And then they also, which you also did in your dissertation, they evaluate social media posts, because people are maybe a little hesitant to say things in person, but they put all sorts of stuff online, and you can use that information to get feedback on the test. So what does the experiential approach add to that would make it even better from the perspective of the test taker or any other test user?
Mhm. I mean, what I can imagine right now, and definitely, again, that will depend on context, depending on who is implementing this, but on one side, the experiential approach brings this conceptual framework for assessment experience. So yeah, I mean, when you have like a test agency that is actually doing their work very well, they actually do like all of these things. But how do you know that you have covered all experience? That's a question that some people don't ask necessarily. So they kind of like have an intuition, like, yeah, maybe we should ask these people, maybe we should ask here and there. But how you are completely sure that you are covering all the assessment experience? If you are interested into that, of course. So at least one thing that experiential approach can bring is that it gives you like a map, basically, of like, okay, what is something that maybe we are not asking yet? Like, for example, maybe some particular type of user in certain part of the assessment experience. And that's kind of like one I think important update, or I don't know, something valuable that experiential approach brings. They can guide a practitioner and kind of map experience, like see it more clearly. I think another difference is that in the experiential approach, I am making very clear this idea of the appropriateness, like coming back to MESIC, coming back to this idea of asking if it is appropriate or not to use a test, and see that through moral philosophy, and see that like on what are the values of the communities affected by the use of the test. This idea of the communities affected by the use of the test, I think, is also like a important thing, in the sense that sure, we can include students, we can include teachers, but in some cases, there are communities that should be there and not necessarily are there. So for example, I don't know, like certification of nurses. Who is affected by the decisions made by that test? It's not just nurses. It's not just like the teachers. Actually, it's the patient. The patient also is affected by the decision you make with that test. So from that point of view, the patients also should be, at some point, be part of the process to understand and have their input on how they are affected by the decision they are making with the test. There is a very interesting paper from two authors, Cheneman and I can't remember the other, but they speak about this certification test used for sign interpretation language, like people that do the work of do the interpretation of sign language. And they actually come back to the concept of situated knowledges, and they do this very interesting criticism, that test, the one for certify that someone is a good sign interpreter, doesn't have any input whatsoever from deaf people. So how is that you can actually know that an interpreter is actually doing their job if you're not asking the actual person that is receiving the message? And that it's so absurd, like how far we can go in this kind of like disconnection, that it really like challenges like I don't know, a very basic sense of of who should like bring it, who should bring it, who should be in the table deciding or at least be part of it. That's another thing about the experiential approach, in that I am being very explicit. People affected by the uses, those people should be there, not whatever we think, but the people that are affected. That for now. I think there are more things, but I spent too much time, I think.
Well, I like that answer, and that's yeah, and that's the part that excites me the most. I'll add something else that you hinted at but didn't say directly, like who owns knowledge? right? Who gets to decide what knowledge even is? Why aren't people from the community at the table when they're even trying to decide what to test and how to test it? And there's at least one instance where, and this is the Hawaii assessment, the Kaipuni Assessment of Educational Outcomes, where they actually did have community members in the room, like during the time that they were trying to develop these blueprints.
Yeah.
So yeah, and that's the part that really excites me the most. So thank you.
Yeah, and so one last comment. I mean, I agree with you that in general, in the test industry, when you are doing a job, they do all these things that you mentioned. But I can see many others that they do not do that. And I think the experiential approach is also helpful, like a reminder that if you're not doing that, why you should be doing that. So yeah, I mean, I think you are posing like the best case, and I'm glad that you were able to work in that. But there are many other places and tests that I are not doing that type of work. So yeah.
Thank you, Michael and Sergio. I wish we had more time. I'd ask if Michael has a follow-up question. And this discussion reminds me that this is an assessment, and for the next 15 minutes, we define knowledge, right? So with that, let me move to April. April, go ahead.
Sure. Sergio, I just want to echo Jennifer and Michael. It has been an honor and a pleasure to be on this committee and to be part of this conversation and watch you wrestle with some really challenging and forward-thinking ideas. And I think that what you've proposed here, it's what Michael and Jennifer said. It is going to be really great to see this get out there, get published, and for people to be thinking about these ideas and how do we do this and how do we bring this into our practices. I think it has every potential to change how we do things. Certainly how I do things anyway. And I'm at the beginning of, building a couple of assessments here at UMass. So thinking of how we can use these ideas right now. One thing that, really came through and I really appreciated in your dissertation, your especially chapter 6, I think, is you said, you said you had failed studies, and I wouldn't call them failed studies, really. It was things that you tried that didn't, pan out, but what it highlighted is it's hard to get participants. It's hard to sometimes to elicit some of this information that we need in order to do, from the start. How do we, and you mentioned the idea of, this has to be things that people are interested in, and I like the analogy. It was, I think maybe it was Jennifer, it said, when people build games, they're vested because they're vested in that game experience. So my question here for you is methodology. Based on what you've learned through this process from user experience research, what are your recommendations? How do we move forward to get participants to participate? And, from the beginning, we want them at the table, we want them sitting at the table when we're defining and deciding what to measure, and through the process, not just in a kind of reacting place after, how do we get them engaged through the process? Just what are your recommendations having done this? And, you got some really good stuff and sometimes it didn't work out the way you had hoped. What are your recommendations?
Yeah. First, I think I will speak from theory. So part of the literature reviews and things I read during the program, it were related, some of the work I read was related with theories of motivation. And actually, there is one particular theory that I like a lot. It's called self-determination theory. That kind of is a psychology theory that explains how motivation works. In that theory, they speak about 3 components of motivation: self-determination, connection with others, and a sense of competence, a sense that you have control and you can do so. So in that theory, if you have these 3 together, then you will have like an intrinsic motivation. And if you fail to have any of these 3, then you will have a more motivation, but it's more external, it's more like exogenous motivation. And you don't have any of them, you will have apathy, like no interest. So, and that as a theory is very interesting to understand what's the reaction of people to testing in general. Because most of the time, people are not really being respected in their self-determination when they do a test. And so, of course, from that point of view of the theory, of course, your motivation is going to be like out. Also, connection with others. Most of the time, tests are individual. So how is that we are connecting with others through the process of being assessed? Not really much. And the sense of competence. That actually relates a lot with computer adaptive test, because this sense of competence means that I am receiving a challenge that is kind of reasonable for my level of skill. But sometimes in testing, we want to know if someone doesn't have that level. So it will happen many times that a person will receive a challenge that they cannot really succeed. So from that perspective, I think self-determination is maybe the most important. And it's also tricky, because basically if you are initiating an encounter, you need to kind of like guess what they would do if they would have self-determination. and that's why also participatory methods are better, because you don't come with something and you allow them to kind of like tell you what is something that is important for them. So I think in general, explore participatory action research is a good idea to understand how to like engage the communities, because with that you will have that self-determination aspect. The connection with others and the competence will depend more on the details and how do you make this happen. But self-determination, I would say, is like a very basic thing to have motivation. So you need to find a way, if you are kind of forced to propose something, try to have like a very good guess of what they would do if they could have control. And if not, if you have the actual room to do participatory things, allow them, like let them tell you what they want to do. And I think that's, for a psychometrician, for people in our field, that's very hard. I am a supporter of that idea, and I find myself many times blocking it without even knowing that I was doing that. But it's like a habit that we have, that sometimes we want to kind of like bring something when actually we should just the thing that we should do is just listen and just let them tell you what they want or need. That's very difficult.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, great question, great answer. To be continued, right? We're not going to end the conversation today. But in the interest of time, Sergio, I really like, I mentioned this before, how you connected so many different things. You took everything you learned here in validity and other classes and connected it to Dewey and feminist theory, and just really, really impressive. As you know, the dissertation defense is not just where the committee asks you questions about your dissertation, but we can ask questions about anything you've learned during your graduate degree. And so I've got a question from Lisa here on multivariate, a question from Craig on structural equation modeling, and I just wanted to ask something about regression discontinuity design from research methods. Unfortunately, we don't have the time. You played your card. So, but I will say, we might not have the time to answer this, but I'll put this in your head. I really like how everyone in measurement can take something from your dissertation. I mean, there's a lot there. The people are going to like all of it, might be few, but everyone's going to like some of it. And I think the heuristic value of it in influencing test development and test validation and so forth is huge. You start with some definitions, and what I think we need to continue to talk about is your definition of validity. So when we talk about validity in class, I give Messick's definition at one point, and then I show how the standards definition kind of simplifies that. Your definition is complicated, and I guess my question is, I want to think about evidence to support the use of a test for a particular purpose, and I don't really see the evidence in the definition. I see it in a lot of your validation technique, but in the definition of validity, I might push you a bit more on that. I don't know if you have time to address that now, or we'll save that for the next time we meet in person, but I did want to just poke at that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's actually one difference between Messick definition and the definition I proposed. In that Messick says very explicit theoretical rationales, empirical evidence that support. So all of that, I kind of like save it in the concept of situated knowledge. And the tricky philosophical kind of like thing in that in that chain is that what constitutes evidence is something defined by the communities. And that's a difference, a divergence from Messick, in the sense that Messick tells you, okay, this is what you need to support. The feminist take is a little bit different. It's kind of what the community believes or what is their way of understanding these things and what they consider as evidence. Because the problem with Messick view, actually, and that was like a thing I never liked that much about his definition, is that he doesn't include values. So usually in a modernist project of science, you will think about theoretical rationales and empirical evidence, but you won't think values as something supporting. But in my opinion, that could be, and it depends. It depends on what in the context in which you are, and those values are the values of whom, and how do you decide on those, and so on. So I would include like values also in those kind of like supporting elements, and depending on what the communities think that is relevant or what constitute evidence. So that all of that is kind of like capturing this idea of situated knowledge.
Great. Well, thanks very much for that. And I like that answer. I think we do look forward to discussing a bit more. I'm going to create a breakout room because I think the committee needs to do what we are supposed to do. It's just going to take me a moment to do that. Jennifer, Michael, April, and I think I can get there. Damas y caballeros, el comité necesita discutir el destino de Sergio. Vamos a volver muy pronto. I've got to get to the breakout room. I got to figure out how do I put myself in that breakout room.
You need to stop the recording because you will record the discussion.
We can continue to work together. Yeah.
I think you
Jennifer?
have to say that again, Michael, so that
That's
the
it, yeah.
recording gets it.
I just want to say congratulations, Sergio, and I hope we get to work together in the future. I'm looking forward to great things from you.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
You'll notice I paused the recording for all the nice things I said. I don't want future students to think I'm easy. Jennifer, go ahead.
Oh, I don't think you have to worry about that at all, Steve. No, Sergio, I want to say also congratulations. I think this, well, you know, I've been very impressed with this body of work. I think it's going to have quite a bit of influence. And I'm really looking forward to seeing where you go next. How do you publish this work? What are your next steps? I'm looking forward to watching that journey. So congratulations and thank you for the opportunity to get to work with you.
April.
Sergio, it has been such a pleasure. That's where I started earlier. It is just to watch this theory, this ideas come and evolve. Every time I read this, I said this to the committee, every time I read your document, as Jennifer said, I learn something and I like it even more. And it will be amazing to see where this goes. And I'll be, in the front row watching your career and where you go from here. So congratulations.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you, each of you members of the committee, for accepting to participate in my committee. I really have like a world-class group of people here. I mean, you are awesome. Each of you are like really like top on this. So, I mean, I'm so honored, to be honest, to have this committee. Is really, really awesome. Thank you very much for all your insights and feedback. It was so great and amazing. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sergio, for saying that. And I want to thank April and Jennifer and Michael also. I mean, it's the holidays and taking the time. Antes estamos terminar, me gustaría invitar a su madre, otras personas en su familia. ¿Quieres hablar sobre? I probably
They,
said that poorly. Do you want to translate for me, Sergio?
they were
Translate my Spanish into Spanish.
they were already kind of like congratulating me as you were in the record room. But yeah,
That
Steve,
doesn't count. That doesn't count because you hadn't been
true. Yeah, Steve,
passed yet.
Steve pregunta si es que alguien de familia o no sé si quieren hablar o decir algo ahora.
Karen.
Sí, hola, solo hablamos español por acá. No,
Vale.
Sergio sabe que yo soy su tía menor. Nos llevamos muy, muy bien desde chiquitito, así que un orgullo, Sergio, felicitaciones. Sé que es un gran logro, sé que ha sido un gran sacrificio también estar lejos de la familia. Por acá, igual estuvimos con el Martín. He escuchado atentamente, no entendimos mucho, pero después veremos la traducción. Pero eso, decirte que te queremos mucho y estamos muy orgullosos de ti. Y espero te ver pronto.
Sí. Muchas gracias.
Un abrazo
Karen.
grande.
Gracias.
Un abrazo.
Yo también,
Okay, well,
hijo mío, ¿estás
Sí.
feliz? Sí. Un abrazo grande, hijo, para ti. Me alegro mucho, mucho de un logro más en tu vida. Un niño brillante, un hombre hoy brillante siempre desde pequeño, ávido de aprender y descubrir nuevas cosas, y con un ímpetu y una resiliencia, pero que le ha permitido salir adelante, luchar siempre por lo que quieres, con altura de miras, siendo honesto, transparente y siempre con tu idea al frente. Un abracito y te felicito, me siento absolutamente feliz de que logres un paso más de muchos que vas a hacer. Te amo mucho.
Gracias, Karen, realmente mucho.
gracias, señora Galarte. Sergio, we're just about ready to go. From all of us at UMass, congratulations. We wish the best for you. We know we'll see you around. Any final words from anybody?
Just from my side, I will tell them in Spanish so the family can also hear me. But Sergio, de parte de los que te conocemos desde hace tantos años, desde los 12 años, siempre te hemos admirado por distintas razones. Esta es una más y espero que sigan muchos pasos en la parte académica, que sabemos que siempre has destacado y que sigas realizándote como persona, que nos alegra mucho verte así. Un abrazo grande.
Gracias, Miguel. Muchas gracias. Y do you want to appear in camera? Sure. Yeah. I think I should thank my boyfriend. He's here. So yeah.
Hello, everyone. Hola.
The famous Robert. Hey, we're nice to see you.
I'm famous now.
Hello.
Yeah, and I want to
Oh,
thank
yeah.
my boyfriend Robert too, because he has been like such a support in all this time. And yeah, I mean, truly, this is a big thing that I owe you. I mean, you have helped me so much. So yeah.
And I'm very proud of him. He has worked so hard to get to where he wants to be, and I see great things for him, and I'm happy to see them and happy to support him, and happy to be here at this very important moment in his life.
Yes.
Thank you, Robert. And you have a tie on too. That's Uncle
Yeah.
Robert. That's
We are
impressive.
like
Well, I hope you have the time to celebrate. I'm sorry I can't be there with you, but hopefully we can do that soon. And Robert, it's great to see you up and out. So, yeah. Xavi. Camila. Maybe they're trying to clap.
Primo, felicitaciones. No puedo prender la cámara porque tengo aquí instalada la tele para que lo vea la abuelita.
okay.
Te quiero mucho, te mando un abrazo gigante a la distancia y eres un ejemplo para todos nosotros de esfuerzo, de todo lo que haces, y sé que esto es un paso y que te queda mucho más y mucho camino hacia adelante y estuvo espectacular.
Gracias. Un besito a usted allá también.
Sergio, I'm going to have to run. I just made you the co-host if you want to continue the meeting.
Okay, sure.
But again, very proud of what you've accomplished. For those of you who are not part of the psychometrics community, maybe some of this was not as understandable. Let me just say this is a very significant dissertation. What Sergio has accomplished will definitely have an influence on the field. And we're super proud to consider Dr. Sergio Araneda Galarte one of our alumni. Happy holidays, everybody. Felices fiestas. Feliz Navidad. Prospero año.
Feliz Navidad,
Thank
Merry
you.
Christmas.
Merry Christmas, everyone. Happy
Navidad.
holidays.
Que nos
Muchas felicidades, Sergio.
Gracias.
And very good Spanish. Oh, you already went.
se fueron todos. Sergio Andrés, en español, ¿qué nota tendrías?
No sé si me colocan nota, pero soy doctor ahora. Tienen que llamarme doctor Araneda.
Doctor Araneda.
Gracias.
Sí. Ya nada de dígame licenciado.
Ya no soy licenciado, no. Soy más, soy doctor.
Qué buena,
Aprobó
Sergio.
y está listo.
¿Ah?
Eso en el fondo. Se aprueba y eso como no hay una
Claro,
nota.
sí, es que creo que no tienen nota al final los títulos de posgrado como este de acá, creo que no tienen. Sí.
Bien,
Pero sí.
hijo. Felicitaciones nuevamente.
Sí.
Eso. Hermoso.
Gracias por conectarse. De verdad que
cómo
fue
no.
lindo verlo todo.
Desde la Patagonia. Desde la Patagonia para ti.
Exacto.
Felicitaciones, un abrazo, te mandamos todo acá.
Gracias, tío. Muchas gracias. Gracias.
Felicidades, te salió muy lindo.
Felicidades.
Gracias, Javi. Gracias.
Felicidades.
Eres el más bacán de todos.
Ay,
El
qué
más bacán.
lindo. Gracias.
Sí, de verdad. De verdad que sí. Ya, de ahí pelamos bien. Un abrazo gigante. Chau.
Ok. Chao.
Chao, Sergito, que van a estar a la escuela. En la casa,
Ok.
estoy esperando yo termine. Besito.
Ok, listo.
Cariño,
Abracito.
nos vemos. Chau, chau.
Chao.
Chao, un abrazo, Sergio, que estés bien, pásalo bien, disfruta de este éxito.
Disfruta y celebra mucho. Merecido.
Ay, sí. Qué alivio. Oh,
Sí, al fin.
al fin.
Oye, la grabación sigue por si acaso.
Está. Chucha.
Sí.
Ya.
Ya.
Está la abuelita.
Chao, te queremos mucho. Ahí está la mamita.
Gracias, Wally, por conectarse.
No, te amo, hijo.
También te amo mucho. That's my grandmother.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Oh.
Vamos a ser un gran personaje.
Gracias.
No.
Ya. Un besito. Chao a todos.
Chao, Sergio.
Chao.
Gracias.
Dile chao,
Chao, un abrazo.
Muchas felicidades.
Chao.
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 Chao.